floating crystal necklace, you need 9 rectangular faceted crystals. These are smoke with an AB finish, and they're 8 millimeters by 4 millimeters by 4 millimeters. Then you need 10 faceted crystal rondels. These are clear, also with an AB finish, and they're 3 millimeters by 2 millimeters. Then you need 20 of these faceted crystal rondels in silver. They're a little bit smaller, they're 2 millimeters by 1 millimeter. To put it all together, we're going to use 19 strand bead stringing wire in silver. That's what we're building our necklace on. And we're going to put the beads in place and have them stay in place using crimp tubes or crimp beads. And these are number 1 size in silver. They come in this little tube, but they're these tiny little crimp beads. For tools, you need chain nose pliers, wire cutters, and a ruler. And to finish the ends, you need a lobster clasp with a jump ring and 2 clamshell bead tips. To get started, we went ahead and cut a 20-inch piece of our bead stringing wire with our wire cutters. The first thing we're going to do is slide a bead, one of our rectangle beads, onto the bead stringing wire, and we're going to slide it down to the middle of the necklace. And to find the middle of the necklace, I'm just going to match up my ends like this. Then I'm going to slide my bead down so that it's right in the center of my bead stringing wire. And then I'm just going to lay this out gently and make sure that that bead stays right where I've got it. And I'm going to put on my first crimp bead, and that's going to hold that bead right in the center for us. So I'm going to take a crimp bead, and these crimp beads are teeny tiny. So I end up, dropping a few while I'm working. So it's always good to have a few extras on hand. But I'm just going to feed that bead stringing wire straight up into that crimp bead. And now I can slide that crimp bead down right next to my bead. And then I'm going to pick it up, holding the necklace or the bead in place so that it stays in the center. And I'm going to use my chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to reach in, grasp that crimp bead, and I'm going to flatten it right onto my bead stringing wire. And as I'm flattening it, I'm making sure not to bend my pliers at all, because this bead stringing wire will kink, and you don't want to create any kinks in your necklace. So now one side of our bead is nice and secure, and what I want to do is do the same thing on the other side to keep my bead in place. So I'm going to grab another one of my crimp beads here and slide it on. And these crimp beads really are the magic of this whole necklace. They're what hold the beads in place and give it that floating sort of magical look that make it like an illusion necklace. So again, I'm going to reach in and crimp this bead, but first I want to make sure that my bead is slid all the way up next to my other crimp, and that way there won't be any slack, so the bead won't slide around. So I'm really just using gravity for that. And I'm going to reach in and flatten that other crimp on the other side, and now that bead is nice and secure right in the center of our necklace, and we can start building out from there. So we want to have 10 millimeters between each one of our little bead sections. So we're going to measure from crimp bead to crimp bead. And what I like to do is just pick any section of my ruler and use a 10 millimeters. So I'm going to mostly go from the 12 millimeter mark to the 13 millimeter mark, just because it's right here in the middle of my ruler. So to do that, I can take my crimp bead and put it right on the 12. And I know that I want my next crimp bead to go right where that 13 is. And what that will do is create the same spacing throughout the necklace. So I'm going to slide on my next crimp bead, and I'm going to let that slide down. And then I'm going to measure from my 12 to my 13, and that'll be my proper spacing. And I'm going to grab on to the bead stringing wire, holding that crimp bead in place. And I'm going to flatten that crimp bead using my chain nose pliers, just like I did before. And now I'm ready to slide on my next little section of beads. And this next little section of beads, we're using the smaller silver rondel, followed by our larger clear crystal rondel. And this will just create a little cluster, like a little component. And then another of our silver smaller rondels. So there are 3 little beads like that. And now I just want to follow that with a crimp bead. And that will hold those 3 beads together in that little cluster. Here's my crimp bead. And I'm just going to let that fall down into place like that. And again, I'm going to let gravity do a little bit of work here for me and make all of those beads fall together with the crimp bead on the top there. And then I'm just going to reach in with my chain nose pliers and flatten that crimp bead on my bead stringing wire. And you can see already that I've got 2 sections on my bead stringing wire and they're not moving. And it looks super cool already, which is very exciting. So before I measure this time, just to make this go a little faster, I'm going to slide on my next crimp bead and have it slide down. And now I'm going to measure where I want that to go. Again, I'll measure crimp bead to crimp bead, which is, I'm doing 12 millimeters to 13 millimeters. I'm going to hold that in place and crimp that bead right on the wire with my chain nose pliers. And it's time to add our rectangle bead again to get our pattern going. So there's our rectangle bead. And now I'm just going to follow that with another crimp bead. And you'll see that that's our pattern. It's just going to go rectangle bead and then our little cluster of 3 rondels with a crimp bead on either side of each little component. And that's going to hold them in place. So I'm just going to continue with this pattern. I'm going to measure each time between the crimp beads so that I've got 10 millimeters from crimp bead to crimp bead. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going back and forth between these 2 components that we have here, the rectangle bead and the little cluster. And I want to make sure I've got the same number of beads on each side of my center bead. And then I'll show you how to finish the ends. I finished beading the bead stringing wire, adding all of my rectangle beads and my rondel beads with little crimp beads on either side. And now I'm ready to finish the ends. And to do that, I'm going to take a clamshell bead tip and slide it onto the wire. First, let me show you what a clamshell bead tip is if you don't already know. A clamshell bead tip is like this little clam finding, and you can see it's a clam shape. It's got a little hole in the bottom, and ours has an open loop. And what that does, you'll actually see what it does. It's kind of magical. It helps us finish the ends really easily. So I'm going to slide my bead stringing wire up inside that clamshell bead tip, and I'm actually just going to let my clamshell bead tip fall. And now I'm going to add a crimp bead, and the crimp bead is what's going to make this clamshell bead tip stay in place and help us finish our necklace. So I'm going to slide that on my bead stringing wire, and then I want to crimp the crimp bead onto the bead stringing wire in the same way I've been doing, which is with 10 millimeters in between from crimp to crimp. So I'm going to measure, just ignoring my clamshell bead tip there, I'm going to measure from crimp bead to crimp bead. So that's where we want it. So I'm going to hold that in place, and I'm going to go ahead and crimp that on my bead stringing wire, just like that. And before I slide the clamshell bead tip up, I'm going to go ahead and trim the wire right next to my crimped bead, my crimp bead. And bead string wire is a little bit hard to cut with these fine wire cutters, but there we go, that worked. Now I'm going to take my clamshell bead tip and slide it up and over that crimp bead. So the crimp bead is sort of nestled inside the clam. And I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to very gently close the clamshell over that crimp bead, just like that. And because it's got an open inside, you can smash it pretty easily, so be careful, just be kind of gentle so you don't ding the sides of the clamshell bead, of the clamshell bead tip. And now I want to add my little lobster clasp to the end here. So I'm going to slide that on my open loop, just like that. And then I'm going to use my chain nose pliers again to just rotate that loop closed, just like that. And if you're worried at all about your ends opening or the clamshell bead tip and the crimp bead inside, you can always add a dab of glue inside the clamshell on top of the crimp bead. You also can add a dab of glue there where I just connected that loop, but we've never had a problem with these opening. So there's one end done, and now I'm going to repeat that on the other end of my wire. So I'm going to start by feeding the bead string and wire up into the bottom of my clamshell. Oops, I missed, there we go, like that. And I'll let that just fall down next to my beads. And I'll take my crimp bead and slide that on next. And these crimp beads, by the way, come in lots of different metal finishes. You can find them in gold and in antique bronze, and so you really can have fun with this design and use any beads you want and any metal finish you want. So I'm going to measure from crimp bead to crimp bead again. I've been doing from my 12 to my 13, and I'm just going to hold that in place. And I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to flatten that crimp bead just like we've been doing all along. Then I'll use my wire cutters to trim. There we go. And then I can slide my clamshell bead tip right up and over my crimp bead. And what that does is it sort of hides the crimp bead inside, and it also gives us the little loop that will help us finish the ends. So I'm closing that clamshell bead tip with my chain nose pliers, just gently pressing it closed. And now I can feed on the other side of my clasp, which is just a jump ring, large jump ring. And I can use my chain nose pliers to rotate that loop closed, just like that. And now the other end is nice and finished, and you can just clasp it with the lobster clasp right into my little jump ring like that. And there you have a finished, beautiful floating crystal necklace.